Hello, and welcome to the Contractpreneurship series, a podcast that delves into the world of contracting and provide insights to commercial and legal professionals on how to unlock value from contracts. Contractpreneurship is a concept I introduced to describe a particular approach and mindset in relation to contracts. It brings together the concept of an entrepreneur, a transformer, reimagining how things are done within the world of contracts. A contractpreneur is a transformer who reimagines how things are done along the contract lifecycle, thereby unlocking commercial value and driving real, sustainable and profitable growth. I'm Peggy Pauwels, and today you're listening to episode 1, where we will explore the value of commercial contract management and how optimizing your contracting processes can reduce your cycle time by 30% and even increase your margins up to 5%. So I'm delighted today that we're expanding the Contractpreneurship series and that I'm able to share the microphone today with Thomas. Thomas, welcome.
Thanks to you, Peggy. Thanks for having me. Het is geweldig om na al die jaren hier terug samen te zitten en vooral ook veel ervaring mee te brengen om eigenlijk de passie die wij delen verder te gaan onderzoeken tijdens deze podcast.
En wie had dat gedacht na 16 jaar dat wij samen in een podcast zitten? 16 years that we've known each other. We've worked together at BT. You were part of, at the time, my bid management team. I'm so proud that actually you're one of the examples with, giving someone a platform, enabling them to spread their wings, that you've outgrown, not just me, but many of our colleagues at the time, and became CEO for the BT Benelux region. So Thomas, on that introduction, and again, fantastic to have you here. Do you want to share a bit more about your career path and how the world of contracts has come into that?
Yeah, thank you. It's first of all, thanks for the nice words. It's I'm feeling a little bit ashamed actually. It sounds a bit too much, but if I look back, and I think it refers to when we of course met each other. But first part of my career was very much orientated around pre-sales activities, sales activities, deal making activities, and actually it's almost partially thanks to you. You have given me the platform to grow when we were working together in Brussels and Amsterdam mainly, where I afterwards, second part of my BT career was very much orientated on general management, where actually it's all about delivering the value, delivering the top line, delivering the bottom line, and building that customer relationship into the market. And where the last few years I've been very orientated on driving big global transformational changes, which actually don't look at the region, but much more look at, and if we talk about the contracts, on how do we actually look at the end-to-end cycle, and that starts from generating opportunity up to actually exiting contracts, but really have a fundamental rethink on how you do it, and also fundamental think about how do you drive the value out of it. And that's actually makes it I'm so passionate about the topic, because I truly, when I saw your blogs that you started a few months back, it absolutely triggers the right type of topics, because that's all what it's about. It's really having that value conversation rather than getting completely dragged into or the contract language or the detail or rigorous and blind execution, if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense, and it's fantastic that you've already kind of given a flavour of all the things that we can talk about and unpack a bit further. So let's start. And did you have like a ha-ha moment where you realised, this is what contracts and contract value is all about, or how did that come, that realisation come about?
Yeah, it's funny. So actually, it's not one pointed moment in time. Actually, I can look at it. And on top, I'm an engineer from background, so definitely a dummy in the contracting space when I came from university. But it actually gradually came, and when I reflect over it, it actually started very much with the basic thing which everybody everyday experiences, is that contracts are ultimately, if you want to buy something, you sign a contract. If you do a transaction, you sign a contract, but actually not really thinking what it really means. That's the first experience, where afterwards, of course, with stepping into the commercial roles and the bid management role in your team, then I would almost describe it that the first piece of learning is is observing what actually happens in the contracting phase. And in the beginning, you kind of think that everything that happens is for the right reason. Yeah. And that's actually also the moment that you start allow yourself to learn. And and maybe this one moment actually that started to trigger me to at least start looking differently at contracting, and that has all to do with, I was in it was a big contract negotiation. It was in the US on top. It was with it was a big network type of contract. It was services on top of infrastructure ultimately. And we're sitting in a negotiation room with lawyers on our side, lawyers on the other side, deal makers on our side, deal makers on the other side. And you have a typical behavior of people trying to show off how great they are and how they are going to screw you to a certain extent. Yeah, it sounds a bit wrong. And actually, there was a fairly senior lawyer from our side who was sitting there. He was not the most alpha male type of guy. He was a very silent guy sitting there. At a certain moment, he says, "Look, but can we, before we continue this conversation, just speak to each other and say, do we actually want to do something with each other?" Yeah? And actually the question mark on why are we here actually started for me to really twist the whole discussion about, but it's a value conversation you need to have before you think about contracting, before you think about negotiation, because if you don't keep the value in mind, then you never write it down properly. And on top, if you don't trigger yourself to be able to say we have something in common that actually makes it exciting for us to be here together, because contract is between parties. If you don't have that feeling, let's not do a contract. That needs to be the basic position. And over the years, of course, I've further developed and really came to the discussion about, but contracting is not about the volume of terms you negotiate or the size of your contract or the complexity of your contract. It actually really comes down to, do I actually continuously know what I actually want to achieve and what's going to drive value? And that's not only in the contracting phase, but it's equally in the execution afterwards. Does that make sense?
It's interesting, isn't it, to look at contracts that actually they're an articulation of a relationship, right? That you're about to start, but quite often, both parties don't look at it that way. They look at the commercials, the money that is derived from that relationship. And I want to unpick that a bit further around negotiations, because you're right. There's two big phases, right? When we look at contracting, it's the pre-contract signature phase. It's the deals. It's where all the focus in an organization tends to be, because everyone sees the dollar signs and the pound signs at the end of it. And then there's the in life. What happens when the contract's signed? If we look at those two in order, so let's start with the negotiation phase. Phase that you touched on a really critical point around. Hang on a minute, before we start negotiating clause X, Y, Z, what is it that we want to achieve? So, and I wrote about this in one of my blogs that I think the pandemic showed us, quite often lawyers get very excited about liability and force majeure. And they tend to focus on articulating and capturing in clauses the worst possible scenario that could happen, and then, what to do about it. Pandemic showed that your force majeure clause does not help you fix your problem, your real life problem. So what's your thoughts around that in terms of negotiating? I mean, there's quite some interesting data from the World Commerce and Contracting, right, on that. Do you want to share a bit?
Look, and I need to actually quickly look on my paper, but indeed, if you look at what World Contract and Commerce actually did in their analysis, you see the most desirable part of a contract actually describing what the solution, what are we actually going to do together. But in reality, the majority of time goes to clauses like limitation of liability, termination rights, that type of things. And for me, it is, look, and I know the next question is how do you turn it around? But the drive that actually in that negotiation process actually drives why people are looking at it is, first of all, of course, is risk avoidance. Everybody thinks that by having lengthy debates about limitation of liability or lengthy debates about de-risking the contract, that actually is really meaningful. Because in reality, if you actually look in execution, that people then say, I want to quantify every risk, but not every risk is quantifiable. So if a risk is not quantifiable, don't try to quantify it almost. So you need to start having in my opinion, on risk, a different mindset on how you manage and how you deal with your risk. And that's not always by trying to limit it in the contract. And a second big driver, but that's my personal view, is that of course the way how people who are in the contracting room are targeted and how the business is evaluating the value of a contract is of course completely wrong. Because if you look at termination clauses, and you can look at termination clauses, termination of the full agreement, that's a specific topic, but very often contracts, definitely in the services space, also have termination rights and termination for convenience clauses on individual services in that contract. And the only reason why they're in there is because that gets the salespeople paid for the deal, because everybody thinks by having a termination for convenience clause in there with a penalty linked to termination for convenience, that makes that the relationship is going to deliver more value. But in reality, that's not true, right? Because in reality, in my opinion, it distracts from the value conversation again, because you actually preset an environment where people are going to manage. Of course, you manage for bottom line and you manage for top line, but you should actually drive 80% or 75% of your bottom line should be driven by value, and that you tactically have 25% that's driven by these type of clauses that make the contract sticky. Fair enough, that's reality, but you need to get that balance right. And a lot of the contracts ultimately get negotiated where the balance is completely flipped around, if that makes sense.
And you touched on targets could drive that, obviously, profession. If lawyers need to demonstrate their value by assisting the negotiations, they obviously need to contribute. But how can we turn that around? And interested, because obviously if you touched on it already, the value actually lies in what you're trying to achieve, and actually lies what happens or doesn't happen once the contract's signed. Is it, to your mind, part of the problem that we see in the negotiations, that people don't fully understand what happens after the contract signed and when a contract goes into, let's say, production?
Yeah, the thing is, and it might sound contradicting to what we said before, is that because I believe the contract is super important, but I also believe the contract is not important. If that makes sense. The problem is that when you implement contract management discipline in life, which is a super, super important capability that you need to have in your business, because if you look at the value of a lot of businesses, of course, if you want to divest the business, for example, what does a buyer buy? They buy assets, they buy intellectual property in general, and contracts. So that's actually what it is. It sounds a bit basic, but that's actually what it is. That's what they value on, and where they will pay a multiplier on, and so on. So ultimately, your discipline on how you manage and understand how risk and opportunity is managing your contract is fundamental. The only thing is we implement it in a way that, and it's also, to a certain extent, do we actually allow people to manage contracts in a different way, is that it becomes very much, look, we are signing a contract on day X, and for the next 5 years, we're going to manage against what we've written down on day X. And that's, of course, by definition, in an economical environment that's continuously changing, in a reality that's continuously changing, is actually the value needs to come from continuously rethinking what was the ultimate. It actually goes back to my thing that do we know why we are actually sitting together to agree a contract or write down the relationship we want to have together? And actually continuously allow yourself to benchmark with the initial plan. And that doesn't mean that the initial plan cannot be adjusted, but you need to keep that open mindset, because otherwise you risk to flip to starting to manage obligations. I'll give a stupid example. You in a big distributor contract, so distributor contract, you sell services to a company that's going to resell it in the market. So that's, in general, you cannot, you kind of put a contract in place based on expected volumes, for example. And what you typically see is that people are going to manage that contract and going to say, look, but you didn't meet the volume, so you're going to pay me a penalty, or what are you going to do to compensate for it, rather than actually having a conversation about what's the root cause of the volume not pulling through. Because actually, if you know the root cause, then you can actually try to help your distributor to address the root cause and actually really create value. While in the short term, it sounds like, okay, I can charge a penalty that delivers value, but ultimately it doesn't. And for me, it's getting that mindset shifted is quite fundamental.
It's fascinating to hear you bring it to life like that. But I want to slightly challenge what you've just said, because imagine I'm a small business and growing, and so the volume of my contracts is growing, and maybe the depth of my relationships or the nature of my relationships is changing. I hear you talking about mindset around contract, and I'm sitting here. I don't even know what basic contract management discipline is. So how do we square that? Because is there an argument to say that you do need, the basics of what contract management is, and I would like to get your thoughts on what that then constitutes, in order to enable perhaps to develop that commercial mindset that you talk about?
No, don't get me wrong. I'm completely with you. The basics are fundamental, and the basics, in my opinion, are, and in the environment where I build my experience, a lot focus on P&L management. But I do think that contract management is actually a bit different from, in my opinion, it's a lot about risk and opportunity management. But opportunity management is a very important part of it, because the tendency is to be very much focused on the risk, because that's the easier area, and for people the more comfortable area to look at, because the contract is very specific and actually driving it, where opportunity needs more creative thinking to a certain extent. And the P&L, and the top line and the bottom line, is a reflection of how you perform ultimately in that contract space. Those basics, implementing them is fundamental. The only thing is, and that's and in the big corporate, processes and procedures are of course super important. You need to create that framework, that methodology, that discipline, and do that very consistently across your contracts, because otherwise the language you use is not understood by people in the business, which is very risky. But it is a framework, it's a guideline. What you want to avoid is that you think that the computer is going to contract manage, because it's not true. You need to be passionate about it, because value is not generated by the computer or by the process itself. And maybe in the AI environment things will change, but at least in our experience and where we are till now, it's definitely the case.
So risk management is important, but I like the fact that you stress and underscore the importance of the opportunity that contracts bring, and I couldn't agree more with you. And that's truly, if you see that happen in life, for me that is quite magical. And I think that's, for me, there wasn't one moment like but it is something when you see it come to life, where you've got your framework, which is your contract. It's kind of sets your guidance, it's your roadmap, right? But you overlay it with thinking through the risks, the opportunities, how you leverage your relationship, where you are going as a company, and how that relationship might have to change. If you bring that together, the contract can actually be, not just your roadmap, but even, sort of guiding you and informing you how to change that and optimize that relationship is
Yeah, absolutely. I completely recognize it, and because I was also reflecting on it, because the risk is in the value discussion is that we of course start becoming very dreamy about value. It's of course finding the right balance, because what I have examples and where actually the value discussion becomes very central, but actually also becomes very toxic, because if the answer to every problem is, but we have joint value we are trying to go after, then you actually also don't have a healthy environment. That's why the contractual balance between, what is the key fundamentals of what we are trying to do and also contractually trying to do, because you need to have skin in the game, otherwise it's very difficult. But finding that balance between keeping really value focused and do those core fundamentals is quite important. I had an example fairly recent, doing a big outsource where there is asset transfer, people transfer, and doing an outsource. Actually, BT not being the supplier but the customer, and actually the party where we do the negotiation with actually does the outsource, that actually afterwards starts seeing the risk of I take over stuff, I don't fully understand what's in there, and trying to kind of push risk back to BT, and always using the argument, but the value. Look, we do this not for that outsource piece. And in those conversations, then I think you, managing a contract in life, you also need to actually kind of dare to step back and say, look, fully agree with the value, but there are some fundamentals which are, of course, part of the foundation of why we are sitting together, and that means that you need to do what you promised to do. So I'm a big believer of finding that right balance. The only thing is, find your priorities. Don't think that in a contract, which always becomes hundreds and hundreds of pages, that managing each obligation, a contract, is very effective. It's not effective.
Fantastic. So I think if I can recap in terms of, your guidance, it's making sure that at the negotiation stage, sort of the joint commitment that parties want to sign up to and what they want to achieve is well understood, and that effort is placed when negotiating is placed on that, rather than going through the list of, the mandatory clauses that one needs to have. But then once in live, there is value, talk about the concept, there is importance of understanding those basics and keeping everyone to their commitments, I think, right? Therefore, you manage risk, you manage your obligations, but it doesn't stop there. That detail of what the contract says informs you of whether, it helps you to test whether you're still achieving those outcomes. And that can then help inform and drive the value conversation about, hang on a minute, what is it that we're trying to achieve? But there's no harm. Actually, it's quite commercially important to hold each other to account, right? And that's also what the contract is meant to do.
I 100% agree. And for me, looking at a discussion with a few years back with Tim Cummins from WCC about actually, why does a contract cannot be 5 pages, for example? And that's, of course, also very, very, very kind of black and white in one direction. But ultimately, you need to ask yourself the question, because actually, if you make it simple, then it is for parties in life also much clearer on what you actually want to do with each other. If you make it too big and try to cover everything, and it comes to the risk discussion again, if you think that contracting is about de-risking everything, then it's wrong, because then actually you didn't ask the question, why are we actually sitting together, and why do we believe if we sign a contract for 5 years, for example, that we need to do this for 5 years, because it means that you want to do something different. That's almost a mindset thing that you need to get into.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's a fantastic point to capture, is that there's more to contracts, and I do agree, the mindset, how you look at contracts is key. And I think that is probably, context for a next conversation. But for now, Tomas, I can't thank you enough for your insights and sharing a passion around contracts.
Just started.
So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in. I'm Peggy Pauwels. I'm a partner at Deloitte Legal Management Consulting. If this conversation has triggered curiosity, interest, if you too are struggling perhaps with your contracts and your contract processes, and you want some help in figuring it all out, or just a conversation around how to do things differently, please reach out, and thank you, and hopefully have you join in the next podcast series of Contractpreneurship. Thank you.